Well, it's great to be down at the SFU Woodwards campus because I'm more frequently at the SFU Surrey campus, of course, because it's just down the road from us at the Bear Creek Park where the Surrey Art Gallery is, and just really incredible program that you guys are putting together here. I mean, this week alone is, apart from me, I think there's some pretty incredible stuff going on. I couldn't make it last night, but apparently that sounded, Dylan, that talk sounded quite incredible. Okay, so I'm going to talk for a little while. I hope that we're going to have some time for questions at the end. I'm going to try to keep an eye on the time. So thank you to Am for the invitation. He invited me to do a talk about Surrey art and the Surrey Art Gallery. In some ways, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to talk about Surrey art and the Surrey Art Gallery through a larger sort of optic around the proximities of mainly the south of Fraser region, South Fraser, different sort of nomenclatures for that, but I'm interested in the south bank to Boundary Bay region that stretches along the coast, and how artists, visual artists, but also I've been doing some work around writing and how writers are engaging with that, the stories and experiences of that area, but also the larger set of a larger notion around proximity, let me say, to begin with. So while I'll certainly touch on art by Surrey-based artists, and here on the screen high up above, it's appropriate that this is so high because I'm going to talk a little bit about verticality and art sort of in relation to some of the artists that I've been interested in. But Lisa Chen is a Surrey-based artist, an emerging artist who's doing some really interesting work right now with light and sort of translucent synthetic materials, and there's a sort of a portrait of hers. And art made by non-Surrey artists, in the case of Ken Lum, who actually did teach, or he did work in Cloverdale for a while, and that was partly the experience that led to him creating this work along the highway in 1978. Entertainment for Surrey, but also thinking about a larger set of practices beyond Surrey artists or Vancouver artists working in Surrey. We've seen some really interesting dialogue between artists in New Westminster and from the Tri-Cities and Langley and Ladner. And while it may seem kind of parochial and somewhat small, in many ways it's a very rich, and I'm going to try to sort of maybe paint a bit of a picture in terms of what I think is a really dynamic conversation that's going on. Even if it isn't a direct conversation, I think the work is kind of feeding off itself and the other artworks around it. So by proximities, I'm thinking also of the international circuits of cities, social relationships, regions that connect the diverse populations of south of Fraser with a kind of global contexts. So while the condition of life in these edge cities is still in many cases suburban, dominated by low-density single-family homes, international, national franchise stores, etc., this condition continues to figure in the work of artists working in the community. And this urban characterization increasingly, however, doesn't really capture the full dynamic of what's going on, the shifting nature of the city. And I've just brought together a few sort of images that are circulating around some of the new architecture and more densified areas in the north and the south. And artists, as they tend to do, are in a variety of ways actively engaging in trying to capture this shift. And in what follows, I'm going to look at a number of artworks and artists who have been working on the south side of the Fraser River, as I just mentioned. And in doing so, I'm going to draw in part on some of the exhibitions that I've been working on and my colleagues at the gallery have been working on, and also just non-exhibited art, so artworks that I'm aware of and quite interested in that hopefully will lead to some projects either at the Surrey Art Gallery or elsewhere soon, I hope. The talk will cover really artwork from 2000 to the present, and it really is a small selection of what is going on. So I'm going to focus on, in part, not exclusively, two kind of representational trajectories of practice. And I'm kind of come up with a kind of language, and sorry, it's really kind of clunky, but it's just a really more of a placeholder for now until I find something to accurately kind of capture some of what's going on. But I'm calling one of the approaches a kind of inverted transection, so a sort of cross-section or transect, sort of mode of representation. And another, a kind of open compositing. So the idea of the composite as opposed to the collage format of representation. I'll come back to those kind of designations in a moment in relation to some of the work. So the presentation will examine select artworks that engage with the Canadian Edge city condition and situate these artistic strategies within the Vancouver and international art contexts. So here we have a couple images. The first... the first generation of what were sort of been referred to as the Vancouver School had and in some cases continues, I would argue, a vision that their art had encompassed the larger metropolitan region. This was certainly evident in the 1972 project Architecture of the Fraser Valley, in which a group of artists and architects created an artist book archive documenting the vernacular architecture of the Lower Mainland. Including part of Surrey and Delta, a project. It was spawned, it actually spawned many offshoots and influences, but has really been overshadowed by, and it wasn't actually influenced by, in part, Jeff Wall's landscape manual, according to some of the participants in that project. So it was somewhat of an artist book, but also an architectural survey, but it really did look at the larger metropolitan region. The image of Vancouver was an expansive one. The terminology of Metro Vancouver, to my knowledge, did not exist at that point. It was more the bureaucratic designation of the GVRD, the Greater Vancouver Regional District. And so Vancouver was a kind of placeholder or name for this larger set of spaces and conditions. So it implied a larger expanse of the Lower Mainland, and that whole area was subject to the inquiry of art. So one thinks, for example, of, say, Roy Arden's work in Mission. He did a project around a Catholic school in Mission that taught Indigenous peoples, or his work in Richmond later in the early 90s, for example. Or Ken Lum's Entertainment for Surrey, which we just saw on the screen. Performance and ensuing video from 1978 was also indicative of how this notion of the city encompassed a larger space. By the 1990s and the first decade of the 20th century, the scope of Vancouver art with a capital V, was not perceived to be something that exceeded the city limits of the city of Vancouver proper. The only greater Vancouver subject matter narrative admitted into that seemingly sanctum of Vancouver art appeared to be from the North Shore. So I was always kind of interested in how Vancouver art could encompass the sort of North Shore within its designation, but largely the space further afield to the east and to the south was kept out of that kind of narrative. The Vancouver artist Ron Terada's cover image of the 2005 exhibition catalog, Vancouver Art intertitled Vancouver Art and Artists, shows a roadside scene with a prominently displayed sign that reads, "Entering the City of Vancouver." Among other things, it is a deliberate sort of parody of the by then well-worn tropes of the so-called Vancouver School of photography, the roadside signs, the highway embankment, the meandering footpath. The due date on this iconography is made emblematic by Terada in his literal foregrounding of the burned-out, yellowing grass of the highway side embankment. Yet there continues to be artists active in the larger there continued to be artists active in the larger area of the Lower Mainland who continued to look to the suburbs to try to capture the flux of modernity. And some of them were working beyond what certain critics had worried at the time was becoming a more mannerist or academic version of this Vancouver art set of strategies. And So the next generations of artists were taking on different strategies beyond the city space, and I've been kind of interested in this other tangent of, not exclusively, but a tangent that does engage with urban space and other, but also artists who are working within sculpture or abstracted strategies or relational strategies outside of the downtown proper. What I want to argue here tonight, in part, is that this continuing set of art practices was not, in its best instances, a reductive regionalist practice, but a broader set of art-making strategies that was at once global in its reach, but this globalized reach was due in strong part through its engagement with the local. And I feel that sometimes there's this real strong anxiety around the idea of the local within the contemporary sort of international milieu. There's a kind of fetishization of a kind of global circuit of discourse, and there, of course, are important things to be learned and experienced through that global discourse. But I've been, I think, in the last number of years, very much interested in really looking more at the local, outside of even strictly a kind of a regionalism, and we can maybe talk about that later on if we have time. If Vancouver art, in quotes, has become enormously visible internationally, especially for a city of its size, it is often remarked, the art from its broader orbit, such as the south of Fraser region, has remained on the outer edge of that exposure. This speaks to the dynamic of art power that still largely abides by the center-periphery model of cities and cultural production, but it does not acknowledge often enough the quality and experimentation in the artwork being made outside of its city scene. So by focusing on this specifically defined area and the number of visual artworks made there, I'm not so much attempting to produce an investigation of place, though certainly certain places are made more resonant by these artworks and vice versa. It could be argued, I think, well, I would certainly argue that that is the case. This effort really is about more, for me, representations of types of spaces located on the traditionally designated periphery of the metropolis, one that can be found in similar circumstances across the continent and around the world. What the urban critic Thomas Sieverts has referred to as the urbanized countryside, a sort of condition that collapses the city and periphery, simply what he calls where we live now. It is worth mentioning that, well, I'll touch a little bit on the history in this North American context in a moment when I look at the specific artworks, that the suburbs have long been a place of special consideration. Many of the most celebrated French Impressionist painters of the 19th century, for example, looked to the suburbs to capture the key dynamic of the modern condition. Consecutive generations of artists in cities around the world have followed suit in various specific variations, certainly. But I think it can be argued, and what I'm trying to assert tonight is that we have a special instance of these practices happening in the larger Metro Vancouver region, in Surrey and its proximate areas. I'm not going to discuss these two works, but these are just two works in our collection that I think are significant in different ways, both Evan Lee and Scott Massey's pieces around sort of landscapes south of the Fraser. So the Ontario-based philosopher and culture theorist Jonathan Bordeaux has remarked how the notion of terra nullius, land belonging to no one, has exerted considerable influence within Canadian landscape traditions. For example, he has traced the way that First Peoples in the territory of Canada has been made largely absent within the iconic artworks of many of the Canadian canon, not just the Group of Seven, though certainly does focus on some of their work. And if one reads the contemporary papers, it sometimes seems as if we haven't moved that much ahead. It's easy to forget that places that we live, where we live here, whether it be the inner or outer suburb or elsewhere, actually have a history of human and cultural production that is thousands of years old. Indigenous and post-contact histories of human habitation on the south bank of the Fraser River has been addressed in diverse and innovative ways in the past by many artists at the Surrey Art Gallery. One thinks, for example, of The Site Source collaboration from 1988, where Barbara Cole and Don Romanchuk and Judy Davis worked on a sort of a earth art project in South Surrey and mirrored that practice in the Surrey Art Gallery. Quite an incredible project, really. And others such as Don and Cora Lee Leger's Ephemera installation of 2002, which was a sort of personal portrait of Surrey history and their own personal histories in Surrey and further afield, or the Kwantlen writer and concrete poet at times, Joseph Danderand's text artwork called Four Seasons of the River that examined the history of the Fraser River through his own perspective as a Kwantlen writer, and many others that could be cited. However, it appears that maybe we're undergoing a bit of a resurgence in interest by visual artists in these longer histories of this place and its hidden over memories and stories. Former Surrey resident and now Victoria-based artist Jeremy Herndl has made many paintings about the area of his boyhood home in North Surrey. As the title of his painting suggests, what the viewer is looking at is a cut bank, the cut bank Cacate up on the top left. And that is a place, as you probably are aware, cut banks are where, in the case of these riverside locations, the river has eroded away the embankment to reveal a kind of inner or sort of the inside of the earth, whatever that might be. So this here is the edge of the Fraser River, sort of opposite of New Westminster on the what was once referred to as Brownsville, a sort of town site, and has been kind of incorporated into the larger city of Surrey. Quite an important location in terms of the history of the lower mainland. The title also suggests that the image is linked to a specific location with a specific history, near the grounds of the old Brownsville town site that existed in the late 19th century, where a Kwantlen seasonal village, fishing village called Cacate was once situated, and sometimes spelled Q-A-Y-Q-A-Y-T. You might have come across it, or sometimes pronounced Cacite, on what was then called South Westminster Indian Reserve. That was the sort of, again, bureaucratic title for this reserve that was created. And there was once, according to historians, and if you get a chance, I really strongly encourage you to read Cecily Nicholson's new book of poetry, For the Poplars, of the Poplars. It's an incredible sort of look at the history of the Cacate peoples and Poplar Island just off of New Westminster. But Cacate here in North Surrey was a traditional sort of seasonal fishing village that existed there. So Herndl appears to want to draw attention to the long history of settlement at this location. Most recently, it's his centuries-long hosting of extensive heavy industry. The sheer mass of discarded consumer objects seems to have almost replaced the ground itself. But as Herndl paints the image, it appears less to be about garbage or litter per se, and more about human history itself. A history literally right beneath the viewer's feet, made visible through the flow of time, emblemized by the river itself. Herndl has created a kind of allegorical image, I would argue, about place and memory. The painting distills what an image form sort of related to what Simon Schama, the historian, has written about in his book on memory and landscape, where he says it excavates below our conventional sight level to discover the veins of myth and memory that lie beneath the surface. Not just this image. I think it's a larger set of images that he's done around the Whalley area over a number of years. The depiction of the 180-degree angle here, or 180-degree perspective, creates a warping of the perspective in the painting, so that the objects appear upended and pushing out onto the canvas as the landscape that we usually observe on the surface recedes into the distance. His method of revealing this to the viewer includes the following. A kind of form of visual cross-cutting, a sort of inversion or tilting up of space, a kind of composing a combination of real and imagined objects, or maybe found and remembered objects, a kind of forming of an allegorical image, that is allegorical in the sense that a description of one thing through the depiction of another. The garbage in itself is really more about a kind of human experience more than a sort of specific object. I mean, for him, he's also very interested in how, and he paints a lot of detritus in his work, discarded things, and how it relates to kind of abstract traditions within painting. So I talk about this as a kind of inverted transect, and I'll return to it. And sort of, I'm still sort of working through it and thinking about it. And I don't think it's distinct to this this region by any means, but I'm interested in the kind of cross-sectional method, the sort of allegorical approach to this in some recent art. So I've included, alongside Cutbank Cacate, a photographic image by the Langley-based artist Suzanne Northcott, who had an exhibition at the Surrey Art Gallery a number of years ago, where she's, like Herndl, she mostly works with landscapes. She's made a number of paintings of the Great Langley Bog, and I might have a chance to come back to the figure of the space of the bog, which I think is such an important one for the region. And I think many commentators have made the case in various texts. But what I like about the image, Bog Grass, from I think it's 2012, I believe, is the way she creates a void beyond the edge of the grass through her play with light and reflection. The edge that leads to the darkness is ambiguous. We appear to float beside the shore, Ophelia-like. The color is so ultra subtle, it's almost black and white. Her use of colors through photography and in her, she does a lot of painting around this space of the Langley Bog as well, is quite remarkable. So I want to quickly just show another couple images by Jeremy Herndl. These were featured in an exhibition called Figuring Ground at the Surrey Art Gallery last year. The Mayflower and the Trojan up on the top left. They depict a landscape that is in a state of rapid transition. Herndl frequently paints his canvases plein air, in this case in a field near the Surrey Central SkyTrain station. Mayflower depicts a modernist apartment tower beside a stand of thinly scattered trees. Really, it's a landmark building in the North Surrey sort of plateau area, which in my research, there's some incredible, I think part of this area was quite dominated by peat bog, and I don't know if they've remediated it or somehow filled it in over the years, but there was a bog in that sort of where now the city center is, I think, right around that area. But it's largely been filled in, and there was quite a commercial production for quite a number of years there. Mayflower depicts this modernist apartment tower. The second image, Trojan, appears to shift perspective, showing a stand of trees at night with the same glass building in the background. The traces of litter and objects suggest that this is not only a site of daytime activity, but it might also be a place where people find reprieve from the stresses of the city. On the right is Claude Breeze's Broken Highway, number 9. Breeze, who lived in North Surrey for some time, is often associated with Vancouver art. And he this particular piece, he discusses in some of the notes in our collection, talks about this, trying to kind of capture this real dominant, this dynamic shift that was going on in North Surrey with the construction of the highway, the expansion of what is now King George, and also I think maybe Highway 1 as well, which would have been happening in the late 60s, perhaps, and trying to capture that visually through these drawings, this series of drawings, Broken Highway. Herndl opts for a more realistic depiction for this more recent wave of flux. His cinematographic zoom and muted color palettes evokes a more subtle and sinister vision than Breeze's more bombastic, frenzied rendering. I want to shift now away from the work of Jeremy Herndl and look at Sean Allward's recent set of works around the south bank of the Fraser River. His collaged cyanotypes. Yeah, so you can see here on the left part of a series of these sort of diptych, sort of vertically stacked images of the inside of the Glenrose Cannery, which has undergone a certain manner of transformation, which I'll get to in a moment. So these collage cyanotypes and inkjet prints, Cannery 1 here, is part of a larger set of images that address another space in this rapid transition, that is in rapid transition, and part of the deep history of the area. The Glen Rose Cannery site, which lies on the Fraser River near the Alex Fraser Bridge, is one of the most significant cultural sites in southwestern British Columbia, yet its significance and history is largely unknown to most residents of Metro Vancouver, I think would be safe to say. According to archaeologists, the Glen Rose site and its nearby site of St. Mungo dates back over 9,000 years as a sort of human settlement and human habitation, predating other local sites by 4,000 years, which is pretty incredible. As local environmental ecologist and historian Anne Murray asserts, it is the most ancient archaeological site yet discovered in the Lower Mainland. The 115-year-old fishing cannery building and its history of it's undergone its own sort of transformations and histories there, is the main focus of Allward's recent project. The cannery building was demolished in 2011 by Port Metro Vancouver in advance of the building of the South Fraser Perimeter Road, a 44-kilometre four-lane highway, as part of the Gateway project that included the Port Mann Bridge, among other things. And then in the other corner here, we have this work also engaging with this deeper pre-contact sort of history of the area and this site under the Knight Street Bridge. The Alex Fraser Bridge that is proximate to the cannery building that Allward is interested in. As with Dikiakos's Sugeson Alex Fraser Bridge, 1991 to 1993, Allward draws a link between the sort of geometric architecture of the cannery's interior and a transcendental sense of deep time and history at the site. So you see here with Dikiakos's use of shadow and sort of shape, these sort of primary shapes, and a kind of using kind of a negative space that connects the sky, and in this case, the sort of human, a kind of monument in a kind of sense of a monument in reverse or anti-monument, I guess, in the kind of Smithson sense. But the Alex Fraser the bridge has a whole other symbolism for the region that I think exceeds that. But you see with the work on the left by Allward, this connection between the abstracted cyanotype treated paper on the bottom linking up with the sort of timbers of the structure itself. So in the details, so Allward used long photographic exposure times to turn the darkened room into a luminous ghostly space. The abstracted blue surfaces of the cyanotype suggest the eternal flow of water and by extension time that has flowed under and through its structure. The cannery was located right out over the river before its removal. And in this image here, you see another sort of extension of this body of work, this Glen Rose project. Allward, he's created a kind of aggregated image inspired by the idea and structures of the shell midden. And this is part of a series of works that he's created kind of to try to address a set of ideas and sensibilities that I think he's after. And I'll get into that in a moment. As with Herndl, Allward develops his own abstracted language to explore the dynamics of deep time and history, nature, and culture. He makes the white pigment from pulverized shells. The Rorschach prints from this pigment create sort of seashell bivalve-like structures. His subterranean cross-section of hundreds of ink blots is combined with a multitude of blue cyanotype shapes and forms on linen. Here's just a detail. In the details, there are images of everything from eroded pilings, fishing nets, stakes that were possibly from weir traps. These images reside side by side with other objects that Allward sources from local thrift stores: scarves, doilies, hats, belts, jean legs. There was one, a leg of a pair of denim jeans that had sort of had this bleached kind of pattern on it that he incorporated into sort of elements of this work. In wanting to acknowledge and respect the sacredness of the site, Allward does not seek to represent its archaeologically sought-after artifacts. The tools are featured. We know these tools if we've been to the Royal Museum. A kind of prominent part of their collection is the kind of the Mungo, St. Mungo, works from St. Mungo and Glen Rose that have been periodically taken out through archaeological digs. But he wants to take away the physical precious objects or their imaginaries. He's not interested in that, but rather he works to create an analogous image. His assemblages of microprints offer a melancholically charged reinterpretation of the archaeological. It becomes a kind of psychological system that at the same time depicts memory and collective humanity that is, literally right beneath our feet. Allward's Glen Rose project recalls, I think in certain respects, Barnett Newman's, some of his ideas that he expressed in his quite famous text, The Ideographic Picture. And of course, Newman was famous for his interest in Pacific Northwest indigenous art. So Newman is quoted in the book, or says in the book, the Kwakiutl artist writes, Newman produces a shape. A shape was a living thing for this artist, a vehicle for an abstract thought complex, a carrier of the awesome feelings he felt before the terror of the unknowable, end quote. If for Herndl, painting is a form of close looking, Allward's printmaking is a form of transcendental thinking and meditation on how, quote, history is formulated as a present experience, as he describes it in his artist statements. And then I just sort of counterpose that with an example of, I'm going to be interested in these chronographic sort of maps of time, cartographies of time, and this particular famous, sort of well-known one from around 1800 by Friedrich Strauss, called The Stream of Time. And it depicts time in a form of a stream. And I just thought, because this is also very much about the river and the sort of estuarial or lacustrine kind of environment, it's very much about that, not just the physical geography, but the kind of metaphor of flow and deep time. Another artist who sort of uses a sort of Rorschachian method and sort of influenced by that image-making tradition and a kind of cross-sectional approach is White Rock painter Jennifer Clark. Her frequently neon-tinged paintings, pictures combine images of plants and sea life along with images of the human body. Her paintings are influenced by X-ray images and other newer see-through forms of imaging technology. The space of her pictures frequently breaks down into crystalline forms that are at the same time seemingly living organisms. As seen here in Kaleidoscope 1, but also together her works examine the relationship between our bodies, our psyche, and these are her words, and our natural environment, the idea of the external and internal landscape. And I wanted to include her work because I think it's quite interesting in terms of engaging with the human figure vis-a-vis the landscape. And I think there's some other emerging artists in the kind of region, in the area that are practicing a similar kind of mode. Actually, in some ways, I think Roxanne Charles is to some extent, but here are two other South Surrey White Rock-based artists, Elizabeth Carefoot, Fragments of Desire. So whether it's the recent past or a deeper history, visual artists are often interested in the otherwise camouflaged, disregarded fragments, the supposedly lesser objects, as a nobler artifact. Plenty of examples of that in contemporary art, for sure. A culmination of 4 years of scouring the alleyways outside her home in South Surrey, Carefoot's Fragments of Desire consists of a series of long fabric strips, each strip stretched to create and stitched to create permanent pockets that contain dozens of tiny found objects, dominoes, bottle caps, rubber, frogs, doll, hands, among other countless things. The sheerness of the suspended material makes each object visible but obscured. It was described by one commentator as a curio-filled curtain. It's pretty accurate, but it's quite an incredible piece to experience in person. On the right, Semiahmoo artist Roxanne Charles' piece Untitled History Weaving, 2013, combines red bark, cedar bark, fabric, beads, and metal wire. And you'll see also the Canadian flag is featured in there as well. Charles describes the artwork as a document of Canada's relationship to the Indigenous movement across the country. The piece, much like the issues in Canada, is raw, and this is a quote from Charles, rough and full of tension. I wanted to capture that in this work. You'll see there's basketry, half-made hats, previously constructed mat up on the right there, sort of tilted to the main frame of the image of the object, and what appears to be two Canadian flags. And she talks about how she also has a part of her practice, which is really incredibly diverse. She works in many, many different media, but she creates these funerary objects for ceremonies around the death of people in the community, and so some of these shapes are sort of inspired by the circular objects are kind of inspired by some of this practice for Roxanne, who's a Semiahmoo from Semiahmoo Nation, and she is doing some very extraordinary work that I don't have time to get into right here. However, I will mention she does have a practice that extends out of this woven work that she does, where she does a lot of performance art that engages with the street, and she's created the kind of not regalia so much as garments that she will perform in, and some of them are woven from cedar bark, but also found garbage, detritus like plastic bags, found fabrics, wire, and string, and they're these quite amazing objects and very much part of the performance. And I originally had a slide with some of them, but I had to take it out to try to keep things within time. But it is this woven this textile part of her practice is very central. But she's really been getting into ceramics lately, which is exciting as well. Here we have a bit of a transition to some other work. Brian Howell's Surrey Homes, 2005 to the present, consists of approximately 50 abandoned homes, photographed mainly in Cloverdale, Langley, along the Langley border, and in Newton. The images of mainly 60s and 70s homes, ranchers, bungalows mainly. According to one reviewer, they symbolize, on the one hand, the, quote, the dream of the white middle class of a life free of the noxious city. And these buildings take on new life as refuge for the homeless, for the drug addicted, and for teenagers looking for hangouts, as this critic sort of describes it from his discussions with Brian Howell. A shadowy population moves in quietly and is gone just as quietly. They're not featured in these photographs. These are empty building interiors mainly. And the reviewer of the same piece discusses, and I think it's a good quote, it kind of captures the ones that I've seen. In these images, we apprehend the afterlife of an effervescent world in its vanishing moments, and the photographs themselves become a species of haunting, a disturbing visitation from limbo. And the picture here is of a kind of half deconstructed house, timber and windows scavenged and removed. For Howell, these are what he calls desolate memory sites, along with the River Road project below by James Nizam. I think it sort of presents an interesting sort of parallel practice where he takes an existing abandoned house along the Fraser River of North Delta and creates kind of cuts into it and creates sort of turns the house into an optical apparatus of sorts. And he had done a number of pieces related to another home, other apartments actually, and homes that sort of a camera obscura treatment of the exteriors of a kind of inner city suburban kind of landscape that was projected into the living rooms of these homes, and similar related works that spun out of that. But here, it's very much about the sort of creating a kind of light, dynamic, abstract shapes, shards of light, is more about pure light and time, I think. Nizam's Shards of Light project recalls the late New York-based artist Gordon Matta Clark's building cuts. And there you see the outside of the house where he's cut into the building and blocked out the windows with wood. Several of which he executed, I should say Gordon Matta Clark executed in neighboring New Jersey. On the left is an image of the house with, no, that's on the right, as I just described, with the windows cut out, or with the incision made. And in the background, you can see the Fraser River. The image by Howell up in the left is also from the same Surrey Home series, and I just find this incredible image where this picture window has been removed, but it's not entirely clear when you're first looking at the image, but this kind of found incision in a way, a kind of picture window of the landscape, how the home is very much shaped by the landscape, and you're sort of within this the camera of the house looking out. Very uncanny kind of image, I think. But one of many from this series that are quite, at times, disturbing, but at times also incredibly powerful in their kind of considerations of the domestic. So there seems to be a resurgence in this interest in the exploration of the counter-monument tradition, including an interest in urban peripheral spaces with their connections to entropy, ambiguous space. Think Robert Smithson and Matta Clark, just mentioned. But Nizam's Umbra tips its hat again to Matta Clark's notion of ana-architecture. And you see it up on the left there, this fragment of the Delta House, North Delta House, brought into the gallery as a kind of end into other spaces. You see in the background images, he brought it to a desert sort of landscape, turned it into a kind of sundial. So it's become a kind of exterior monochrome. So in this way, it departs from Smithson. Matta Clark would also take cuts from buildings and bring them into the gallery. But by using this flat matte paint, anti-reflective paint, he kind of creates this negative space within the interior and exterior spaces that he chooses to present it. Meanwhile, below is another artist who has been working in Surrey, grew up in Surrey, Aaron Moran. And he's quite interested in particularly North Surrey landscapes and this kind of ad hoc architecture and sort of found sculpture. His Stack series, where he finds debris on sites where buildings have been torn down recently, and he creates temporary sculptural assemblages in many ways. And I like this image. I mean, there are some quite interesting images from this series, but it captures this really incredible aspect to the Surrey landscape, and an important feature of the not just Surrey but Delta and Langley landscapes is these power lines and the right-of-ways as a kind of. These are spaces where you, like in Vancouver, you put the subcultures, the teenage subcultures, under the bridges. In Surrey, you put them under the power lines, and so the number of skate parks there. But also, you have malls and major. You have religious sites, temples, and commercial areas under the power lines. They're quite incredible spaces in many respects, and artists have treated them in different ways. Robert Lindsley has a really interesting project that he did a number of years ago about plein air landscape painters in these right-of-way, power line right-of-ways. So this is now shifting to a couple works that I think are endemic of another, sort of symbolic of another approach. Here you have a kind of a sectional treatment of a Surrey landscape of another order, one that also brings together historical time with the present. And this is Michael Markowski's painting on a truck on the Grand Trunk Road. And here he's secured himself in the back of a pickup truck and is driving under the speed limit, but very quite a sort of action. He's done a number of works where he's in a movement on in cars. He's done a piece where what he'll do is he'll recreate these famous or sort of sometimes infamous automobile routes or sort of vehicular routes. And so here he's tracing the old Yale Road, which has a lot of significance in the Lower Mainland. It was the route that connected the Lower Mainland to the interior during the Gold Rush, and was sort of partially supplanted by the Trans-Canada Highway. But here he traces the route of Old Yale Road, the Grand Trunk Road. and paints this sort of plein air sort of impressions of the landscape, the sort of curbside, this verge, if you like. The idea of the verge comes up again and again, not just in the sort of first wave of Vancouver art, but also in more recent practices. And meanwhile, you have Kevin Schmidt from 2010, Epic Journey, presents the artist afloat on the Fraser River while watching the entire Lord of the Rings cycle, projected on a makeshift screen positioned in the middle of his boat, complete with soundtrack. Most of the critical commentary on Schmidt's piece, his 10.5-hour projection, focuses on its duration and connection to music and pop culture. And while these are significant, it's the scenes of the Fraser River South Shore that at night which are quite astonishing and even compete with Peter Jackson's CGI effects. The effect is one of dream and a sort of access to an earlier industrial and pre-industrial history as a form of epic and adventure. And so the idea of the sort of epic, I think in some ways, originally when I was planning to do this talk, I was going to look at sort of looking through the epic as a kind of format. But that would be certainly one of several projects. Now, just shifting to a couple other artworks of a related but different sort, is this number of really incredible projects that have engaged with the peoples of the south of Fraser. For example, Gabor Gastion's work with the series called The Sudanese. Gabor had a studio, photo portrait studio in North Surrey for many years now, has moved it to New Westminster, but is still actively photographing many south of the river. And in this case, one of the largest new immigrant communities, not one of the largest, but a significant population that came to both Surrey and New West primarily that he's captured in this series. But Surrey has a large and diverse population of new immigrants from many corners of the globe. One of the largest new immigrant communities in Canada, in the larger total, larger sort of matrix, and in some cases communities that are marked by conditions of lower income and traveling from former hardship in their home countries. Surrey is also one of the main reception points for government-assisted refugees in Western Canada. Portions of Surrey qualify as what journalist Doug Sanders calls the arrival city, cities where high concentrations of rural, as a quote, rural outsiders without real urban incomes congregate and build connections along ethnic affiliations to mutually support one another. Arrival cities, according to Sanders, are ones where high concentrations of, quote, rural outsiders without real incomes gather, as I just mentioned. But this is logic, what he calls the logic of the bootstrap, which dominates. They're often challenged by rapid urban transformation and, by extension, an elevated risk of fragmentation and alienation. He looks to some of the examples that he examines in his research as Wheaton, Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C., Slotervaart, Amsterdam, a kind of suburb of sort of edge city of Amsterdam, and Toronto's Thorncliffe Park is also one that he focuses in on. Artists have been increasingly interested in engaging with these new migrant communities in different ways. Of course, there's a long tradition, some of them quite problematic, but something I think the Surrey Art Gallery, what we've tried to engage with is this transnational sort of relationship between the local communities and their larger networks. And thinking about art history for us it's very important to think outside of a Western paradigm and to think about the condition of migration and how it feeds and informs the context of south of Fraser. So, for example, we did an exhibition in 2012 called Finding Correspondences, Art and Translation, and I'll come back to one of the works in a moment, but also a project just earlier this year called Ruptures and Arrival that Am mentioned, Art in the Wake of the Komagata Maru. So the photographs here, the William Deng family is of a single father with his children. Emilio Rojas was one of the artists featured in the translation exhibition, Finding Correspondences, which is a phrase coming from Octavio Paz, the Mexican poet, about about trying to capture what translation was about, its essence. And here, Rojas sort of deconstructs a series of letters between Montezuma, the Spanish explorer Cortez, and the sort of mother of mestizo Mexico, Malinche. As part of the installation, the artist offered up his translation skills to help local south of Fraser Spanish-speaking migrants navigate their way through communications in English. Rojas translated immigration papers, want ads, and posted them in a large tableau in the gallery, which is hard to make out a bit in this slide, but on the right-hand side, over the course of the exhibition, these sometimes banal, but also sometimes quite moving texts were accumulating and becoming more unreadable as new translations came in. One of the things that was very exciting for me working, and just in general working at the Surrey Art Gallery, is to have a chance to work with this, also a younger generation of Punjabi Canadian artists based in south of Fraser, Metro Vancouver, and across the country. Many of the artists have been particularly interested in engaging with performing arts traditions, not only South Asian performing arts traditions, but ones which intersect with international performing arts traditions and other cultural forms. For example, in an exhibition we did called Spectacular Sangeet, co-collaboration with Naveen Gurn, the curator. Inspired by her youth growing up in garment factory environments, Anju Singh's project Work is Worship is an installation combining sewing machines and the sound of Sikh prayer songs. The sounds were played back on a Singer sewing machine in the Surrey Art Centre's dormant coat check area. And beside that image, let's see. Sorry, there it is. You'll see the sewing machine there. And then beside that is Iqbal Singh, a project by Iqbal, where she put out a call to women of all ages and ethnicities to learn how to dance the Punjabi folk dance Gidda, a dance meant mainly for women but practiced across genders. Bali Iqbal Singh uses a sort of four cameras within the Art Center studio to record this performance and then reinstalls it as a 4-channel piece in the gallery space. Each channel is then represented on a 4-screen plinth to encourage the viewer to move in a circle in unison with the dance performance. So you sort of become a part of the work. And because it is such a central, the Gidda is a very important form of art and cultural practice in Metro Vancouver, but certainly in Surrey, and it was a really incredible project to be able to work on with Bali, who's really a sort of artist who uses social practice strategies to create her media, new media works. So shifting, I've got a couple more images. How am I doing for time, Anne? 5 minutes, or you're okay? Yeah. Okay, so just a couple other projects here. Stemming out of the Tech Lab residency called Field Studies in the summer of 2013, Sylvia Grace Borda's epic agricultural project, This One's for the Farmer, deployed photography, video, and computer-based tableau to depict Surrey's unique and the south of Fraser's unique agricultural environs and the traces of human stewardship through a multitude of increasingly precious and, in some cases, endangered spaces. Created by flying drones rigged with video camera technology, Aerial Fields presented a series of sweeping panoramas and diptychs of agricultural labor. Here you see a blueberry picker, sort of this 2-channel installation, flattened in this rendition here. It was actually on opposing walls. And of course, berry farming is an important part of the economy and ecology of the Fraser Valley and south of Fraser. So in its focus on laborers and portraiture, it recalls, for me, in some ways, this other quite incredible piece that I'm really trying to get to out of the Surrey Tax Centre, at least temporarily, to show soon. And it's by Ian Baxter, a work from 1977-78 called Surrey Tax Centre Photo Mural, rather benign name, but it was actually created. There are a number of artists invited to create works in the aftermath of some labor some strikes and disputes between management and labor at the tax center, which is, to my knowledge, the biggest tax center in Western Canada as a processing center. An incredible space that I was allowed to get into once during tax time. And it was just a bizarre, surreal environment of envelopes being opened and cubicles that stretched, in kind of Andreas Gursky-like fashion forever. But this mural is in a little rough shape right now, but it's of these portraits of the tax center workers holding mirrors up in front of them in these different landscapes. So they obscure their face, and the reflection of neighboring environments is sort of there. So it's a kind of protest in a way, but also this merging of portraiture and landscape that Ian Baxter and Ingrid, I think this is right at the time that they may have parted ways, but this sort of certainly was something that he picked up in the 80s with other projects. But this capturing of of labor and the sort of a kind of collective portraiture in the community. Okay, so I just want to show another image by Borda because I think it's one of the more. This was an epic she just incredibly diverse and huge effort that she put in to kind of try to capture agricultural life, which is not. It's very rarely kind of depicted, and the challenges that she had in trying to get out to these farms was enormous for various reasons, legislation around food security and health issues and all sorts of different labor practices. But she was able to create quite a collection of work, and one of which was this street view series of tableaus where she actually got a Street View certified photographer that she brought in from Ireland to help her create these tableaus of farmers working, these small batch farmers, smaller farms, to create photographic tableaus in Street View. So, there's artists, you've seen lots of these, I'm sure, artists who kind of appropriate images from Street View in different respects, but these are actually inside the environment. So there's actually a kind of formula of taking the photographs to be able to capture these tableaus. But she's staged these images. Often the subjects who are farming have to kind of hold these poses in ways that early photographers would have had to hold the poses of their subjects. And these are still out there, and I would encourage you to check them out if you have a chance, go through Sylvia's website. But they are quite a moving and an important capturing of this farming life. And she very much came at it from, as she's quite a rigorous art historian, the way that artists in France and in other art historical contexts sort of try to capture this life on the periphery and the agricultural life. So you might have read like T.J. Clarke's work on Van Gogh's Sunflowers and how the city was just outside of the frame. It was very much about this sort of peripheral agricultural, these social spaces as well as the iconography of the sunflower. And then on the left, you have this series that construction sites by Helma Sawatsky, a South Surrey artist, kind of capturing this over a period of time, this development and shifting its matrix. So in actuality, what you're looking at is a plausible house that you could find in many communities all over Metro Vancouver or any big city in Canada in many respects. But at the same time, there's something kind of amiss. And when you look at the image, you start to see the image is sort of broken down. And it's actually an assemblage of photographs taken over a period of quite a stretch of time, this Phoenix complex, 2009. And so I sort of been thinking of this as a kind of form of composited image making that is not purely seamless in the sense of, say, Scott McFarlane's well-known work, kind of Vancouver School photographer, third or fourth generation, whatever it is, where he creates these images that are very the sort of stitching of the images together, made up of, in some cases hundreds and many images. Here you actually see the seams and the buckling of the surface of the image break down. So it's what I'm just calling a kind of open composite representation, but they don't break it down in the sense that some other digital photographers are doing, where it almost becomes a form of collage. But there's a kind of instability to these landscapes and these architectural spaces. She's done another incredible work around Morgan Creek, Morgan Crossing in South Surrey, this quite incredibly quickly developing urban environment, mid-density, so let's say, environment of kind of hybrid new town meets strip mall meets high-end boutiques and kind of quite interesting in certain senses, but a lot of it's under the power lines, and which is quite fascinating to some of the artists who've worked down there as well. So I think in some ways Andrew Singh's piece, which combines the prayer songs of the Sikh laborers in the garment factory, kind of is also a kind of open composite. It's sort of fusing seemingly the song with the sound of the singer, sewing machines, but it's not a kind of collage. It's a sort of drone, and she's been quite interested. She's part of the noise music community in Metro Vancouver, and she's interested in kind of creating this fragile, very beautiful, but at the same time there's a kind of I think a kind of less than harmonious aspect to the piece as well, in the way that she's kind of cobbled it together with found objects and situated it in the coat check. And then I think I'm just coming up on two of the last slides here. So this is another artist who's been working with new media and art technology projects in interesting ways of late, and that's Paulo Majano, who's often fuses together imagery, multiple photographs, and in some cases video and photography. In this this piece here called Campbell Valley Park, he captures this this space that he's described to me. I haven't actually been there, but these trees that are carved, and we've all seen instances of this in various places. But this act of inscribing for a kind of speculative future, a kind of message, but into nature itself, not in the into the rock surface or the park bench, but right into the kind of landscape. And here you actually interface with the image. It's a photograph on the wall where you hold up an iPad sort of apparatus, and you view the image where you can actually, through sort of parallax, you can see what's going on behind objects. So it kind of becomes a 3D space. And he's worked also with three-dimensional objects with this kind of programming technology. But you see here again, sort of inserting the kind of, not here sort of the frayed seams of the images, but a kind of these abstracted figures of these blocks and cubes. So when you look at the image, it actually, these shapes, these abstractions shift as well. And I've just included there part of the Site Source, a 1988 project by Barbara Cole, who some of us may know from her public artwork here in Vancouver, where she's created a kind of performance, sort of time-based performance, photographic and painting project in the South Surrey landscape. And I just thought it was a nice compliment to the Paulo's work. So this is the last image now, and this is on the left. Again, I said I'd come back to the bog, and the Burns Bog is such an incredible, many of us, I'm sure in this room, have been there and experienced it, but it's such a highly resonant site for many reasons. But it's constantly under threat, and there's more developments kind of encroaching on it all the time. But the Surrey artist, Matt Smith, created this sound work where he was interested in this tradition of sound, and we do sound art at the Surrey Art Gallery. And he was interested in this sort of sound ethnographic sort of field recording approach to the environment. And rather than go and record the sounds of the bog, which many artists have treated in different ways, artists who use sound, he took the weather data, information from the weather station situated in Burns Bog, and then through using programming has sort of taken that data every 24 hours, it uploads, and this musical composition, sort of sound piece in the window well at the Surrey Art Centre is made audible. And it's quite a beautiful, subtle piece, but also it's very much about this engagement through the window to the landscape outside. But he's very interested in data and information and this sort of thing as much as this environment of the bog. Debbie Tupa, another Surrey artist, this project, Incessant Notion of Data, is emblematic of much of her recent work, where she takes string and paint, and creates these very kind of tangled webs of these very brightly colored threads, and it's very much about the line, but it's also very much about information. For her, it's a kind of analog for thinking about the role of just these extreme amounts of data. Talking about stacks earlier, I just read about stacks for the first time, and I'm still trying to wrap my brain around it, but these are incredible sculptural environments that Debbie Tupa creates, and I think it's part of another kind of number of artists who are thinking about information in a way beyond a kind of conceptual approach, strictly. So in all this, what I've kind of touched on here, and I admit that the theoretical sort of analysis of it is a bit in development, but I'm trying to sort of touch on some of the artists, and there are many others, and I've left off many of the ones who have been working for several decades in the community doing incredible work. This is just a kind of small sampling of what we are presenting, and if you are interested, next year it's our 40th anniversary, and we're working on a series of exhibitions called Views from the South Bank, which will feature many of these artists and others, to look at certain tendencies and conversations that are going on by artists in the who are not only from this area, but also coming in and working in the community, because I think those are important dialogues that need to happen, and certainly were the dialogues that helped to formulate what was Vancouver art, what became Vancouver art in the 50s and 60s. And what we're working on as cultural workers in Surrey and Delta and Langley, et cetera, to develop and further create a kind of dynamic conversation in the area. So, thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jordan. We've got time for about 20 minutes for questions. I just wanted to point out this is Jordan's kind of the warm-up act, because on Saturday we're going to be renting a yellow school bus leaving here from SFU Woodwards, and it will be emceed by Stephen Tong, a local curator and artist, and the bus will be going to Presentation House Gallery in North Vancouver, SFU Gallery on Burnaby Mountain, over to Mallardville Cultural Appreciation Society in Coquitlam, and then to the Surrey Art Gallery, and ending at SFU. It's for the cheap price of $10, and all the information's up at sfuwoodwards.ca.
Yellow school bus, right?
Yeah, yellow school bus. That's right. There'll be songs along the way. So. Any questions for Jordan?
Yeah, just a quick comment here. Debbie Tupa's incessant notions of data too. Paradoxically, I know it's meant to represent data, right? But it looks figural, almost human figures there, like that, right? And very multicultural, to my eyes, the different colors and so on.
Yeah, I think she's done some interesting things with found dentures and human forms in different ways, more directly, sometimes quite grotesquely. But there's always this tension between a kind of beautiful object and a kind of really disturbing kind of malformed, abject object in her work. Yeah, interesting. Okay, thanks.
Hi, Jordan. Thanks for the presentation. I guess I was curious if you could talk about other sites of art making that are happening in Surrey, because I feel like you showed a lot of really great work and a diverse array of different kinds of work, but as tonight's an example, a lot of art is not just what gets exhibited, but it's social spaces, it's discursive, it's publications. So I'm curious what you might be able to point to from Surrey at this moment that's operating in some of those other spaces.
Yeah, I mean, there's some really interesting collectives of artists, sort of loose affiliated networks of artists who are working on different projects. There's the Day of Drawing group, DOD, Day of Drawing. They just did a performance, an sort of temporary installation on Crescent Beach with these sort of adapted kind of sculptural interventions in these mannequins that they had found a large quantity of. but sort of engaging with that sort of beach scene. That's quite an important site. They've done a kind of mobile unit where they go around Surrey in a van that's turned into a mobile gallery, and that's been quite an interesting mobile format for engaging with the larger city. I mean, didn't mention it, but the city is sometimes remarked as a very large city physically, geographically. It includes, you could fit apparently Vancouver, Richmond, and Burnaby into the spatial sort of area of Surrey. So that's one of the challenges in terms of cultural production, artistic production, is to be able to find sites and places where people can access and in some cases are willing to travel long distances to be able to participate in. So this kind of mobile unit was an interesting approach to that. There's also the Sophia Collective, South of Fraser Inter-Arts Collective, which is doing various projects around the city. For example, you know what? I skipped over A.S. Dillon's work here and Patrick Cruz's work. Well, I'll talk about it in a moment. But A.S. Dillon created a temporary installation at Kwantlen University, a sort of mobile billboard that was located outside of the university and with a kind of kiosk inside the university, which asked people, if you think Canada is a just society, please see reception or visit reception. And so you're encouraged to come into the space. So there was a kind of hailing of the viewer, in the parking lot of the university campus. And Dillon has used this kind of mobile billboard intervention sort of strategy in the city, not just in Surrey and there, but in downtown Vancouver, sort of text-based projects, aphoristic kind of questions and phrasings and words that bring up various conversations around social justice and foreign policy and human rights and other things. And so that's another example. He's part of a collective that has been doing work there. There's a couple of examples. There's quite a few. There's also the South Asian Artists Guild, group of artists who primarily painters and photographers who've been exhibiting and quite active at the Newton Cultural Center and showing work and creating a kind of conversation about painting in Surrey and North Delta primarily.
I had a question for you, Jordan, just around a lot of the circulation of contemporary art really, at least certainly in the Canadian condition, comes from a Western orientation. And there's certainly an inherent tension built in with emergent communities that are coming from outside the tradition. That also provides certain kinds of opportunities. I'm thinking about the fiction book about Surrey gangsters called Daku, which was about this sort of mythical Indian bandit, sort of what mothers would tell their kids, that the Daku would come get you, and it placed upon the sort of gangster scene. And that book, at least it didn't fit the traditional Canadian lit tradition, but it sold really well in Surrey and the Fraser Valley and not in traditional places. So there's these kind of breakout things that come out of these places. And I'm just wondering, as a curator, how you negotiate that kind of tension that's built into working in a place like Surrey.
Well, with that particular writer, we are working on a project in relation to our anniversary that will have a very strong literary focus. We do a sound symposium every year, and next year we want to do something around voice, which we've done in the past, but this will be more literary voice, so the idea of enunciation, the idea of vocalizations and the written word, to engage with the literary practices that are equally kind of languished and ignored by the publishing establishment of British Columbia and Canada. I think much like it is in cities like Surrey, like Brampton or Mississauga or Laval and outside of Montreal, and that there's this whole practice of cultural producers who are writing works of fiction, writing poetry, making paintings that are not part of the kind of narratives of our society in many ways. They work within a kind of these not micro, but certainly set communities of audiences, which unfortunately sometimes there isn't the means and sometimes not the sort of ambition to kind of bring these texts to translation or to be marketed to a larger Canadian audience. There's certainly very strong challenges in terms of being able to get that out there for many reasons that we could talk for a long time about. But I think, in terms of the Daku, the phenomenon, and the sort of the kind of underground economy and cultural economy of Bhangra, hip-hop sort of genre fusions, and DIY filmmaking with various filmmakers in Surrey who are creating narrative films and often using, social media to kind of create these sort of serial television comedies or dramas in different ways. And these are things that are very important for me, at least as a curator, to connect with popular cultural production. I don't see that there's something that should be divorced from the gallery. Do we do it as well as we could in terms of connecting with that? I think we could do a lot better. But I hope that we can have the author of Daku, I can't remember his name right at the moment, but certainly there's just so many extraordinary writers like him who have not received the sort of attention that he has. But there's a whole subgenre of gangster films also that's come out of sort of gangster style films that have come out of the south of Fraser as well, in a similar manner.
I'm wondering about this relationship between center and periphery to a degree, and what pressures you feel being on the periphery of bringing in artists from power centers like Vancouver, or then further abroad like New York or LA or London or Shanghai or wherever else.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know. The center periphery dynamic is still very strong, and certainly, but I don't see the city in those terms really. I think that it's certainly, in terms of the funding structures, there's still primarily, when you look at the discrepancies between funding between suburban Canada, and even though you have these massive cities on the edges of Toronto and Calgary and other places that are where people are producing, when you look at the difference of funding, it's quite astonishing. And there's different reasons for that. Often it's described as this case of there's a lack of organizations that are applying for the grant money. But why are there a lack of organizations? And the city of Surrey has made great strides lately as one municipality there in creating cultural granting programs to be able to help create the next wave of institutions. But certainly we need to do more to be able to create that cultural, I think of in Vancouver with the Intermedia Gallery, and how that came out of just some studio spaces that were gallery spaces and artists experimenting there, and how that came out of a government grant in the late 60s that, Intermedia then dissolved and spawned Western Front, and how these kind of domino effects happen in cities. And, I think the city is much more of a polycentric thing. And sometimes I just, with the exhibitions I've curated, I sort of sometimes playfully sort of think of, well, what if Surrey was the center and Vancouver was a suburb of Surrey, and kind of inverting those relationships, and what would that mean? And potentially that is a kind of speculative future in the next 50, 100 years, as the city will be bigger in many respects. But bigger is not necessarily going to generate the center. That's, as you can see in, I was just in Paris. I had a chance to go and look at cultural galleries in suburban Paris, and how they were engaging with populations outside of the périphérique, the ring road around Paris, and how really incredible projects were going on in different communities in not just Paris, but in some of the other, in Marseille and other cities, similarly, that were very engaged with sort of community-based practices, sort of free school kind of art cultural workshops and temporary pavilions, like in the banlieue by Thomas Hirschhorn's piece, The Precarious Museum, which was in the d'Aubervilliers neighborhood in Paris, is an incredible example of how these things can happen. And I think in many ways in Canada we're far behind that, and we could do a lot more in terms of these ephemeral public sort of projects and things that come and go. And so I think for me the suburban Paris was much more interesting than what was going on in the sort of central scene. They're incredible things, and these spaces were drawing people who were coming from all over Europe. They would go travel an hour outside of Paris to go to these experience these cultural spaces and conversations. So to me, that's where the center is in many ways. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I think you kind of touched on this briefly, but I wanted to ask about it's kind of related to the push and pull of cultural producers within Surrey's city limits. Those that are involved in the idea of identity, personal history, and placemaking versus those that are making work that are not necessarily related to that idea of identity for Surrey or placemaking and that kind of thing. Do you have a preference, or how do you guys handle curating work that's not dealing with identity? Because when I worked at the Surrey Art Gallery, that was a big part of it, was creating place and a sense of place there. So, I don't know.
In terms of working with artists who are engaged with identity in different respects?
Yeah, I mean, there seemed to be a big theme at the time around looking at Surrey and trying to create a cohesive, image or picture of the city. Because it was 25 years ago they just went and drew boundaries around all of these municipalities that got engulfed into it. And it's kind of like drawing borders on a map. There's all these different ethnic groups and people that got lumped into something. And so now how do you identify Surrey artwork versus...
I think that we hear from our visitors and from our community audiences that there is a desire to experience a kind of social experience at the gallery space that they can't get in the city. And you notice and this is it's not unique to Surrey or Delta or anywhere south of the Fraser necessarily, but the social spaces, the pedestrian cultures tend to be in the malls. And the lack, and what I'm struck just, immediately when I started working in 2009, is the lack of spaces to actually put up handbills and posters and get the word out through the sort of physical spaces of the city, because in those pedestrian areas, the malls, it's a heavily regulated, policed space for any kind of free circulation of information. And so... yeah, there's a desire in many cases to meet others from outside of their, immediate communities. And so that kind of platform for a kind of cross-cultural dialogue, but also being, to also look critically at kind of the multicultural sort of conversation and notions of multiculturalism that's sort of circulated by the state and by, the officialdom, and try to look at a kind of critical multiculturalism, what that might be like in terms of engaging with the kind of uncomfortable and difficult issues that people run into in their daily life, and not just in the suburbs, but certainly there are certain dynamics there that you can come across that might not be as present in the kind of anonymity in some ways of the downtown sort of this sort of flow of the metropolis of crowds. There's a whole different relationship to the crowd in the city in south of Fraser. So one of the big crowd gatherings, for example, in Surrey that you might have heard about was the around the hockey, the Stanley Cup a few years ago, where the Canucks were actually performing okay, and people were gathering at the corner of 72nd and Scott Road in large amounts, and it was just this coming together. of people in this sort of intersection. And it raised an interesting discussion around, well, what is a public space, and why why is there not a better place for congregations of large groups, and the city's finding ways to create public spaces in different ways with the new city center, for example. Whether it will be successful could take quite some time. It's quite empty these days in terms of, but it's there. I think it's the long view, right? But I think a gallery or a museum should be ultimately a place where people can come together to feel comfortable to be able to interact, but also should be comfortable to have a debate and disagree as well, ultimately. Yeah, so different cultural values are going to come together, and you're potentially going to get offended because anything is potentially can cause offense. And so how do we as curators and education staff sort of mediate that kind of conversation is like a kind of daily thing.
Is there any more questions?
Yeah, just a very quick one here. There are sort of two paradoxical streams. I really liked your comparison, to the French Impressionists. They went outside Paris and to capture the dynamics of a modern city. And the thought that this is happening here in our Surrey area is phenomenal. I'm really excited about that. But at the same time, the paradoxical nature is that, Doug Saunders' arrival city, Surrey is where many new immigrants settle. That's their first stop, and many decide to, make it their home. And, do you think perhaps that this dynamic of a modern city that is emerging in the Surrey area has got something to do with the immigrant dream, the dreams that all these new immigrants have, that's actually sort of fueling and, the passion and the energy and creating that dynamism. And then the other thing is Vancouver's all built up. There's really no space here to sort of build a new modern city, really. Everything's built up, whereas it's more open in the countryside and, and let's do something wonderful. This kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that we see signs of there's certainly historical instances in Surrey and its region, but there's also new trends going on that I mentioned in terms of some of these collectives. But you certainly don't see it to the degree that you might assume in a situation where you have the largest industrial land base. Surrey is the largest industrial land base in the province, is in the city of Surrey. That's partly because of that geographic space, but they're not the kind of brownstones or a kind of appearance of the sort of warehouse space and studio spaces that you might see in the downtown east side or East Vancouver in certain respects. They're also hard to get to for artists who often are challenged in terms of mobility for various reasons. But I think of like Los Angeles, and here's one of the most dynamic art cities in the world, and it's a very much a similar kind of topology, kind of geographic condition as Surrey in many ways. Like artists are driving incredible distances to get to from different art shows and different events. And I'm surprised that not more artists are resettling on the other side of the river, not just in Surrey, but in Langley because of the affordability. But they choose instead to move to other cities like Calgary with its sort of rapidly growing art community. And you can see the reason why, of course, but there's definitely signs of that shift happening, and that's what I think is quite exciting. And it's something that will just kind of continue. And sometimes it takes people to kind of just jump in and try different things out, and some people are doing that. And so we'll see. I mean, this whole idea of certain cities being sort of, somebody said Surrey's the next Brooklyn. And that was after, recently, New West was the next Brooklyn. And it's sort of like, well, but I mean, I sort of think about like Oakland as an interesting example in terms of Surrey, in terms of, for various reasons, but the fact that many of the artists of San Francisco have moved out to Oakland and settled in a city that for many, many years it was perceived to be not, even though there was quite an active art scene, it was much more underground. But now it's become like one of the most exciting art conversations going on in a city environment. And a lot of that is from an out-migration to Oakland. And of course, there's a whole specific history, whole spatial dynamic. It's proximity to Berkeley. It's proximity to the rail trains that come in and out of San Francisco, relatively short compared to Surrey, to Vancouver, for example. But still, it's the art community in Vancouver tends to be very centralized in many ways, which makes it even more exciting for me to see artists who are doing interesting things in Crescent Beach or in Cloverdale and making a go of it and doing these projects. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much for being here tonight. And I just wanted to share that, Chilliwack is the new black. You heard it here first. And thank you very much to Jordan for wonderful talk.